Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is, well, it's on behavioral science, a discipline that, frankly, for over 150 years has been kind of tormented by its own fragmentation. I mean, you have leading academics from Thomas Kuhn way back in the 60s to, contemporary figures repeatedly calling the field pre-paradigmatic, basically a collection of specialized observations without a shared central theory. The irony we're digging into today is pretty profound. A novel, unified, and importantly falsifiable framework, the Unified Behavior Model, or UBM, has emerged. It claims to solve this exact problem through a elemental reduction. Yet, the reaction from the scientific community? It's largely one of institutional hesitancy, maybe even outright dismissal. So the central question for us is this. Is the failure of scientific institutions to rigorously engage with UBM's core claim a case of institutional amnesia? Have they just forgotten their own long-sought mandate for unification? Or conversely, is the intense skepticism we're seeing actually a necessary display of scientific prudence? The kind required before adopting a claim that's so foundational. I'll be arguing that the long historical failure to unify creates, an overwhelming mandate for immediate structural engagement with UBM's falsifiability challenge.
And I come at it from a different way. I absolutely agree the history of fragmentation is real. I mean, the field has spent enormous energy often failing, let's be honest, to achieve theoretical integration. But I'd argue that the skepticism today isn't forgetfulness. It's actually a display of intellectual humility and, frankly, rigor. Scientific integrity demands deep caution when a single model comes along and proposes to fundamentally reorganize the entire edifice of behavioral understanding and reduce all human action to just 4 necessary and sufficient elements. That's a huge claim.
See, this resistance, to me, it really represents an ironic failure of scientific integrity. It feels like a collective memory loss regarding the field's most urgent, century-long crisis. We have figures like Paul Meehl declaring the field lacks theoretical integration back in, 1978? And Greg Henricus labeling it a hopelessly fragmented discipline just a few years ago. The academic community actively searched for unity. The 1991 NIMH Consortium is a prime example, and they ultimately declared the goal impossible. So UBM steps into this void. It's the first framework, really in the field's entire 150-plus year history, to simultaneously achieve unification, elemental reduction, and, critically, structural falsifiability. It's explicitly designed to solve the very problem they abandon. The model asserts, quite boldly, that all behavior can be reduced to the interaction of 4 base elements: stories, emotions, behaviors, and the environment, SEBE. And to prove the system's structural coherence, that no other elements needed, it offers the no fifth element challenge. Now, this challenge has audited the framework's logic, where even 5 advanced large language models, the big ones, have been unable to crack the system and introduce a logically necessary 5th element. Yet, what's a typical academic response? We need more empirical clinical trials. It's fundamentally confusing a foundational framework with a specific clinical intervention. We really have to adhere to Karl Popper's mandate here. A theory is scientific if it is falsifiable. And a claim of elemental sufficiency like this, it shifts the burden to the community to disprove that sufficiency, not endlessly demand the claimant prove it correct in clinical settings.
That's an interesting point about Popper, though I might frame the implication slightly differently. While I appreciate the elegance of the 4 elements and the novelty, I admit, of using AI audits for structural falsifiability, the sheer scope of UBM's claim requires proportionate scrutiny. It proposes to be the trunk, the central organizing principle from which all other specialized models, CBT, ACT, Fogg's methods, whatever, emerge as mere branches. Now, if this trunk is structurally sound, that's revolutionary. Absolutely. But we must verify the definitions very carefully. For instance, UBM's definition of the environment includes the embodied environment, this internal landscape of genes, fatigue, hormones, pain, you name it. This category is so expansive that experts are, understandably hesitant.
They need time, I think, to ensure this massive definitional scope isn't somehow resistant to refutation, simply because it's so broad, regardless of whether current LLMs can break it conceptually. Skepticism here isn't amnesia, it's intellectual caution about reorganizing the very foundations of knowledge. Furthermore, the model's intentional elemental simplicity, which, yes, is designed for accessibility, this fourth R of education idea, well, that simplicity is often interpreted, rightly or wrongly, as theoretical weakness by academics who historically have equated rigor with dense complexity. So prudence dictates slower engagement, maybe, to establish that this framework is genuinely robust enough to hold the weight of all specialized behavioral science, not just structurally coherent against an AI logic test.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning because it seems to ignore the fundamental nature of UBM. You're demanding the wrong kind of evidence for a structural claim. UBM is not a predictive model. It's explicit about that. It doesn't try to tell you what a person will do. It's a theoretical framework asserting elemental sufficiency. Its utility is in understanding why a behavior exists and how you might influence it, using those 4 elements as a kind of base code. The test for that sufficiency claim is exactly the no fifth element challenge. So, if advanced language models, which are trained specifically to spot logical holes and inconsistencies across massive data sets, if they fail to logically break the system, why do human academics keep insisting on demanding standard clinical efficacy trials? It feels like moving the goalposts. This resistance, frankly, it validates the very claim that the current paradigm is dysfunctional. The field is stuck demanding descriptive empirical evidence for a functional framework, forgetting that foundational science often starts with falsifiable structure, not just piling up clinical outcome metrics. The field's current posture seems deeply defensive, almost like amnesia.
Okay, but the assertion that the burden of disproof immediately shifts entirely to the community, that's a profound theoretical move in itself. It requires more than just an AI audit to satisfy the broader scientific process, wouldn't you say? UBM requires experts to accept a massive conceptual overhaul. For example, it reframes really abstract concepts like consciousness and free will, suggesting they are merely emergent properties resulting from the interaction of the 4 elements. It also claims complex biological and neurological drives simply fall under the embodied environment. Now, for experts who have dedicated their entire careers to specific, highly nuanced domains, like neurobiology or cognitive science, to suddenly reorganize their entire understanding of the relationship between mind, body, and action, based on this 4-element structure, well, that's an enormous undertaking.
Prudence, I think, necessitates a slow, deliberate, conceptual reframing process by human experts, not just quickly accepting a computer's logical check. We are potentially talking about revising, every textbook in the field. That warrants caution. And let's elaborate just a bit more on that definitional scope issue. The source material, as you noted, confirms the historical fragmentation, but some interpret that disunity not as a failure needing a single fix, but as inherent complexity. They might argue that one, quote, simpleton model, a phrase UBM itself anticipates and addresses, cannot possibly resolve the deep, multi-layered nature of human behavior. So when UBM conducts its elemental reduction, it deliberately simplifies by design. Popper called it the art of systematic oversimplification. But this is precisely where specialized disciplines, especially something like neurobiology, might worry that UBM is simply too broad.
But is it?
Well, they might feel the crucial nuance of highly detailed biological mechanisms gets lost or improperly categorized. This skepticism, again, I don't see it as amnesia. It feels more like domain protection, perhaps, and maybe a necessary defense of granular, hard-won scientific truth within those specializations.
But see, dismissing UBM as too broad completely misses the fundamental nature of the model. It is explicitly a behavioral model, not a neurological one, not a biological one. Behaviorally speaking, the body, whether it's a genetic predisposition, a simple headache, or chronic fatigue, is a stimulus. It functions as an environmental input influencing stories, emotions, and subsequent behaviors, just like an external cue from a loud construction site outside or an unfriendly neighbor. To disapprove of including the embodied experience within the environment element,
That would only be correct if UBM claimed to be a model of cellular biology or neuroscience, which it absolutely does not. The elegance is deliberate. It is precisely what allows UBM to be scalable and accessible, making it potentially teachable as the fourth R of education, the ability to understand and systematically change one's own behavior. The refusal by some to recognize this elegance as a form of rigor, and instead to cling defensively to fragmented complexity, that is the institutional amnesia at work. They seem to be forgetting that the grand goal they failed to achieve for 150 years was always supposed to be a unified, potentially teachable framework, not just an ever-growing pile of complicated, disconnected facts. And we really should pause to highlight what UBM actually achieves conceptually, just to prove it isn't some simplistic structure being dismissed fairly. It resolves deep theoretical problems that the fragmented field has wrestled with for decades. Think about personality traits, like grit or discipline. The old fragmented paradigm often treats these as prerequisite inputs you either have or don't. UBM reframes them powerfully as emergent properties. They are outputs of a system, the SEBE interaction that is well aligned towards a goal. Identity itself is positioned not as a fixed input, but as a dynamic, emergent output of your ongoing stories, emotions, and behaviors within your environment. Furthermore, its associated methodology, this P.A.R.R. protocol for aligning, refining, and rewiring behavior, it operationalizes the scientific method for personal habit change. This moves far beyond simplistic cue routine reward models, often derived, let's be honest, from rodent studies. P.A.R.R. allows the individual user to act as a scientist on their own life, designing testable hypotheses about their own behavior patterns. The fact that these sophisticated, abstract innovations are currently being largely ignored in favor of demanding standard efficacy trials, well, it proves the institutions are operating on an outdated and defensive script. They're forgetting the core unification mandate they set for themselves.
They are reacting to a fundamental structural claim with the requirements more suited for testing a specific narrow clinical trial. It just doesn't fit.
Okay, I do acknowledge the theoretical depth there. The reframing of identity and traits as emergent properties, that is a powerful conceptual move, absolutely. It demands serious study. However, the institutions, they have a responsibility that goes beyond just evaluating theoretical structure, however elegant or innovative. They must ensure that the framework's claim to unify doesn't inadvertently result in a net loss of essential nuance for those specialized branches we talked about. That's a legitimate concern. And furthermore, while P.A.R.R is conceptually sound, applying the scientific method to self-change sounds great on paper. The community has a duty to vet its practical application rigorously. We know from existing behavioral tracking systems, for example, that rigid monitoring, if misapplied, can sometimes cause psychological burnout or unhealthy fixation. So the hesitation isn't just about the core theory. It's also about the responsibility involved in promoting a framework that seeks to organize and ultimately influence the practical direction of potentially all existing behavioral theories and interventions. That's a heavy lift, and caution is warranted.
All right. So to summarize my position, the source material, I believe, clearly documents a crisis Henrichs's hopelessly fragmented discipline and an active, acknowledged abdication of the unification mandate over many decades. UBM comes along and provides the theoretical rigor and the structural falsifiability, established via the no fifth element challenge, needed to meet the requirements of a genuine scientific paradigm, the very thing the field claimed to seek for over a century. The community cannot just cling to historical inertia and, frankly, fear of disruption. It really must move past its institutional amnesia and engage with the model's structural claims on appropriate scientific terms, meaning test its falsifiability.
And I maintain that the scientific community's skepticism shouldn't be dismissed so quickly as mere amnesia. It can and perhaps should be viewed as intellectual charity and necessary rigor. While UBM presents a profoundly compelling, structurally sound claim, confirmed, yes, even by the logical audit of AI, the prudent course is cautious, thorough, human engagement with its massive conceptual overhaul and its definitional scope. So the debate we're having really centers on whether the acknowledged difficulty of this foundational challenge permits the kind of institutional dismissal or abandonment we might be seeing, or whether it simply necessitates the slow, perhaps frustratingly slow, but rigorous structural scrutiny that is arguably underway, even if it looks like hesitation.
And that disagreement, I think, illuminates the fundamental scientific question here. When presented with a unified theory that directly addresses the status quo's deepest self-acknowledged failure, does the scientific community default back to the historical fragmentation it claims to despise, or does it finally embrace the rigorous challenge of falsification that it always demanded for a true paradigm shift?
A question indeed that only sustained, rigorous, structural scrutiny will ultimately answer.